All right, in our last three lectures within Module 1, we're going to be talking about our different types of markets. So we've already talked about within a market system, it's going to be supply and demand and the interaction of buyers and sellers that are going to determine economic activity. What goods and services are produced, how they're produced, all of those different pieces. We're going to talk about then now those markets. And markets aren't all the same. And in an ideal world, all markets would be purely competitive. A perfectly competitive market is the ideal, the most efficient market. And we're going to talk about a little bit about why they're the most efficient market. But again, we don't live in an ideal world. There are in-between markets and also the exact opposite of that competitive market. And we're going to touch on all of these along the way. So in this first video, we're going to focus on pure competition, purely competitive markets, perfectly competitive markets, all synonyms, talking about that competitive nature. Then on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have a pure monopoly, and that's going to be the next lecture that we're going to go through. And then our sixth lecture is going to be the in-betweens. And with in-between purely competitive and pure monopoly, we're going to have monopolistically competitive and oligopolies. And this is where a lot of markets, a lot of industries are going to fall in the monopolistically competitive and oligopoly. But let's go through and give some examples and talk a little bit about perfectly competitive markets first. All right, so when we're distinguishing, before we get into some examples, let's talk about how we distinguish what type of market we are in. The first thing I want you to ask yourself is how many firms exist within this market. So we're going to be focusing on the product market from now on until we get to the final optional module within this section. So for now, let's assume we're in the product market. So firms are the ones that are bringing goods and services into the market. And so the number of firms is going to be very important when thinking about what type of market we're in. Next, how are prices determined? How easily can firms exit and enter into the market? How many substitutes or brands of the product are there, and how similar are the brands? So do we see that there are many brands, many different substitutes for this product, and how similar are the products? And then other distinguishing features of this specific specific market. So let's go through, and we're going to talk a little bit about these in terms of the competitive markets, and then the monopoly, and then the in-betweens. So these are the questions you're going to ask yourself and you're going to answer when you're looking at a market. So let's say we're looking at the market for breakfast cereal. We can think about the number of firms within the breakfast cereal. And then we're going to start to think about how are prices determined. Are the price of all breakfast cereal exactly the same, or do we see some variety? How easy is it for a firm to start selling breakfast cereal or take their product off the shelf? How many substitutes or brands of breakfast cereal do we see, and how similar are the brands? And then any other distinguishing features that we might see within that market. Again, we're going to go through and we'll come back to breakfast cereal and really think about what breakfast cereal might fall under later on as we move through these lectures. Another way we're going to start to distinguish, and economists use a ratio to distinguish among these markets. And so first, our concentration ratio, it's going to measure how competitive the market is. And the way we're going to calculate how competitive the market is by taking the sum of the percentage of output produced by the top 4 firms. So let's say that the top 4 firms, or let's say that each of the top 4 firms produces 10% of the market. The concentration ratio would be 40%. Firm 1, the top firm, produces 10%. Firm 2, the second highest firm, produces 10. 3 would produce 10. 4 would produce 10. And so that means the top 4 firms produce 40% of the market. As opposed to, let's say there's only 4 firms in the market and they all produce 25%. All of a sudden, the concentration ratio is 100%. All top 4 firms produce the entire market. And we can see that that's going to be much different than if there's a large number of firms in the market. So we'll look at concentration ratio a little bit more in depth as we go through. And as we interpret it, just how I said, the smaller the ratio, the more competitive the market is. So when we're talking about this pure competition, we can see that it sounds very competitive in nature, and that's going to have a very small concentration ratio. All right, so let's think about tomatoes at a farmer's market. A really big farmer's market. There's many sellers there, and we can see there's all different kinds of tomatoes, but really, I mean, one tomato from another, all sellers are pretty much selling identical tomatoes, right? We have so many options all throughout that farmer's market. This is going to be our first example of pure competition. Many sellers selling almost an identical, homogeneous product. They are very similar in nature. There are so many substitutes, and this is what we're talking about in terms of pure competition. So let's go through those characteristics for purely competitive firms. When we're thinking about purely competitive markets, there are many buyers and many sellers. There are so many sellers that the firms must be what we call price takers. They take the price as given. Prices are determined within the markets. How easy is it for a new farmer to bring a tomato to the market? It's very easy. Firms can freely exit and enter into the market when we're thinking about purely competitive. The products are very similar, identical, homogeneous in nature. And the key feature within our purely competitive market is that all firms must produce at the market price. So let's think about that farmer's market. There's 20 farmers selling the exact same tomato. What happens when one farmer decides to charge $2 more than everybody else for a tomato? Everybody at the market is selling tomatoes for $1 a tomato. One farmer says, I'm going to charge $3 for a tomato. Nobody's going to buy any tomatoes from him. He must charge the market price. He can produce as much as he wants at the market price, but he must charge the market price. Well, what if somebody charges less than the market price? Well, everybody will go to that seller, right? And the seller, why would he want to lose money? He might as well charge $1 because he can. Everybody else is selling $1. He wouldn't want to lose money by selling at less than the market price. So what we see is within our purely competitive market, and what this means is we have many sellers selling exactly the same product, many substitutes, many brands, all identical or very similar. This is going to create a market where our sellers are price takers. They take the price as given. They don't get to charge above the equilibrium because your tomato is exactly the same as everyone else's tomato. And so I must take that price as given. All right. So when we're thinking about pure competition, we traditionally think about things like agricultural products. Agricultural products, a piece of corn is a piece of corn, right? When I go into the grocery store, I don't say, what farm did this apple come from, right? I look at my Red Delicious apple, I say, that's the apple I want, and I purchase it. I don't make the distinction between which farm did it come from. I take all as pretty much substitutes from one another, and I take that price as given. The sellers can't charge a price above everyone else because their product is exactly the same as everyone else on the market. This is pure competition. Again, one end of the spectrum, you're going to see very few products actually fall into that exact category, but it's one end of the spectrum that we're going to start to look at the other end in our next video of pure monopoly.